All right, so this video is going to be aimed primarily towards Windows users, but just to start, I want to say that you can of course use Blender through Steam. I used to use it because I was into the time tracking stuff, but really you get to a point where time tracking doesn't matter, and you're just thankful to be alive every day. And so, I don't use the Blender on Steam version very much, but they're all the same. What I do use is the Blender launcher. This is a free thing that you can get that will basically allow you to download and manage and launch multiple versions of Blender. If we go to the Downloads tab, you can see under Stable Releases that it has listed all the stable releases that I don't yet have on my system. These are kind of old, so I don't need them. Like 2.79a, I don't need that because I have 2.79b. But under Daily Builds, there will list daily builds that you can also download for both currently 2.93 and 2.92. I was originally going to delete all of my builds so that way I could show you guys this from scratch, but I don't want to lose all the builds I already have. So if we look under stable releases, these are the actual stable releases released by the Foundation, which means that they basically should work without issue. As we see listed at the top is 2.83.12 LTS, which is the current most official version. However, I generally spend my time running the daily builds. So for the purposes of this video, I will be reconfiguring my entire add-on setup from scratch so that way I could show you guys how it's done. The setup that I'm showing isn't necessarily the recommended method, but it is my personal method and results in the least amount of insanity. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into it. So from the moment you install Blender and begin configuring it, a Blender folder is created that has all your preferences and add-ons and everything that basically contains who you are. For the purposes of simplifying things, we're just going to rename this to something that Blender won't load, so let's call it anything else. I was actually going to give it another program name to be funny, but we'll keep things on topic. So now that this folder's been renamed, whenever we launch Blender, it will load as if nothing has ever came up before. So we'll just stretch this to fit, and we'll choose left, search, next, and edit, and go to our preferences, and we'll just begin configuring Blender. So you know me, I like to go in and set my theme to something cool like Blender dark. Well, let's see, some of the themes vary between them, so sometimes I get confused as far as what I want to go with. But configuring Blender is one of those fun things that you just got to get in and do, because there's always some things that I feel clash with the way that I think would be a smooth transition. Like I always change the active object to blue now. I don't know why, it's just fun. But we'll go in and raise our vertex size because I'm kind of old, so I can't see so good anymore. So we'll change all that. Also in the graph editor, or not the graph editor, the node editor. See, I'm so old I can't even read this stuff anymore. So let's minimize it, and we'll find the one talking about nodes. Which one is it? Oh, node editor. All right, and down here we want to change the noodle curving just to 0 so we get straight lines. And this stuff really doesn't matter to me. Configuring our environments and studio lights can come later, but I'll try to discuss that over the course of this. And then we'll come back to add-on installation. I don't use emulate 3 button because it messes with alt behaviors, but if you have to, it's a cost we're willing to pay. Also like to search for cursor, and shift right click places the cursor right here. Set 3D cursor in 3D view. We just want to change that to geometry. I always forget to do it. It really doesn't matter, but it's just assistive for placing a cursor and having it snap to the surface. We can also go in and configure optics or CUDA, but how much cycles am I using nowadays? Not hate on cycles is still very nice, and that denoiser is just fantastic. For recent files, I like to list up to 30 of them, and the timer, we could just set that to 1 minute, and everything else is fine. So with this, we could save our preferences. I'm going to select the cube, and I'm going to press Shift H and hide everything except the cube. And from here, we can save our default file. So I have 2 monitors stacked up on top of each other, meaning that whenever I close Blender and I open back up 2.93, it's going to actually open on the wrong monitor, and I have to bring it back down. However, I'm just going to lower this down quite a bit. Like I said, I have two monitors stacked on top of each other, so don't ask why I have to do this, but it's just part of my life. So we'll save the startup file in that position, and now when I open it, all right, Blender's really giving me the business. I'm gonna have to make the window smaller. Also, it would be terrible if this little hack no longer worked. I'm going to have to right click this, add this to quick favorites, lower it, press Q, save startup file, and then I can close it. You know, quick favorites always. However, it's still loading on the wrong monitor, so there's a good chance I need to take it even lower on the monitors. So I have a Wacom that's like the third monitor on my desk, and it's not even on. So now I've turned it on, and I'm just going to drag this down one more level. I know this part is stupid, but it's been a while since I've had to reconfigure with this setup, so I'm learning something as well. And we still have this opening up on the wrong freaking monitor. So I might have screwed up my installation there. But under Q, we now have the ability to save our startup file just whenever. So we're still having this thing pop open in the wrong location, but that's fine. Let's jump over to stable releases. We're going to pop open the LTS, and we're just going to see if LTS has the same problems. So really just going to cut to the chase this time. After loading, we'll just set to search and minimize it. We'll bring it down here, save startup file, get rid of that, and then we open it up, and it's opening on the wrong monitor. So let's move it off to the side, save startup file. And as you can see, having Blender open on the right monitor is its own struggle. Jesus, what kind of struggle is this? Pause. All right, so back. So I went into Google and just typed in Blender opening on wrong monitor, even misspelled it because I don't care. And it brought up this page. And clicking on this page brought me up to this link, which brought me up to another page. On this page, it is discussed how to get Blender to open on a second monitor by using these arguments. So you might be wondering, how would I use these arguments to make Blender open on the right monitor? Well, that is where under the settings of the Blender launcher, you're able to put in arguments. So basically, I just manipulated them a little bit. I still don't understand what they want, but I do want it to open at 1920 by 1080. And just by putting that in, now when I launch Blender, it opens on the right monitor. However, it's not in the right position. I just need to snap it into view, but that's just par for the course. So now we have our startup scene, and when we pop open Blender, it now is in the right area. So just letting you know that, you know, part of getting Blender right sometimes is doing a little online searching to understand the nature behind the issues. Now that I see that Blender uses this offset starting from the lowest corner of the lowest monitor and then going out, it kind of makes a little more sense. That's Blender for you. But now we have Blender loading the way that we want it to. So let's close this out and let's go back to what we were testing, which was 2.93. And if we open this up, we can see that it now is loading in the correct location. So the next thing is getting onto the add-on installation portion. So at this point in the video, we haven't installed any add-ons yet. So before we continue, I want to discuss holding down the Windows button on your keyboard and pressing R to bring up a run window. In this run window, if you type in %appdata%, we can have this take us to our app data location. And that's really a nice way to start, just %appdata%, and we'll just jump to Blender Foundation and then Blender, and we're beginning to see the foundations of our configurations of who we are as a Blender user. If we go inside 2.83, we see that we have a config folder. If we go inside the 2.93, we see that there's just a config folder. And what this means is that with the config, we can just delete this folder and it deletes our identity. And I'm just trying to debate which one I want to test this with. We'll use 2.83 since we didn't set that one up the most, and we'll just delete this folder. And by deleting the config, you've basically deleted your identity of who you are in Blender. So that means whenever I launch it again, it's going to launch with those parameters I set previously. However, it's going to launch as if I've never opened it before, and this is a quick and easy way to nuke Blender. However, I do recommend periodically right-clicking your config and just choosing to send it to a compressed folder, just so you have a backup of your configuration if anything ever goes awry. Sometimes I'll mess around with like an add-on loader or something, and it will just deconfigure everything, and it's just nice to be able to delete the folder and then just right-click, and I'm using WinRare, but I'm able to bring the folder back and basically retrieve my preferences in the event that I'm transitioning between versions. The other thing I want to talk about is how, for each version of Blender, there's a configuration folder. And so let's make this a little more complex by getting into add-on installation itself. So first we'll install a out-of-date version of HardOps. Not too out of date, just a little out of date. And let's see, I have that here. We'll copy the path. And we'll go to our add-ons, install, and drop our path in. And we just want to install HardOps version 3 of the 987 line. And we now have that enabled. After a brief pause, of course, gotta pause for suspense. And now it is enabled. So the next thing is Box Cutter. We want to bring in the previous version of Box Cutter, which we now have. Also, for the purposes of this installation, we'll be installing Kitops. So we'll just install Kitops. And now that's enabled. And Kitops, of course, requires a little additional configuration. I like to go in and put in my name. Under file paths, we should specify our file paths, which I'll need to do. Whenever it comes to Kitops, I have paths on my Dropbox that I connect to that allow me to use it across multiple systems. So we'll just plug some of these in. Kitops has its own dedicated content that goes more in depth about the advanced installation. However, for the purposes of this, I'm just showing you how I would set it up for myself. So like I said, I have all these on a Dropbox, and they're just locations I'm just dropping in. And we will just now save our preferences. So the next thing we'll be talking about is the installation of Synth, which should require not a whole lot of preference configuration because it is connected with Kitops. So in a way they are interconnected. So with that, we now have some add-ons installed, and we now have them configured in a way where, we may not even want to lose our configuration. So with that, we can just actually, one more thing is under Hops properties, under 2 shape, we'll change that to 2.5 just because I've been using a lot of 2.5 2 shape lately. And we will just save preferences and exit. So now this is our setup of our viewport, except we of course want to press Shift H and hide everything that isn't the cube. And we can also press Alt V, set it to EVHQ just so the shading is just right whenever we open. And with that, we can save our startup file. So now we have Blender 2.93.12 or 2.83.12 configured to a level that we do not want to lose it. In fact, we'll get back to that part later. And with that, we will close this out and end this chapter. So right now, the focal point is 2.83. We're dealing with 2.83. However, in time, everything we're talking about will connect with every version of Blender. But in 2.83, if we go into it now, because we installed add-ons, we now have a scripts folder and we have an add-ons folder, and now we have add-ons installed. So this means that, let's open up Blender and give it a moment to load. The suspense is killing me. And here we go. So now we have Blender up, and basically if we go under our preferences, and we look at HardOps, it tells us that there's a newer version of HardOps available. In fact, if we click on the Hops button, it just tells us needs update. In fact, if you see these icons, that means that your version is out of date, and these icons are intended to take you to your marketplace of origin for you to update your product, be it Blendermarket, Artstation, or Gumroad, which are our 3 official marketplaces at this time. So in the event that you need to update and you don't want to disrupt your preferences, it's better for you to close Blender. If you're a beginner with Blender, the simple way to update add-ons is to just remove the add-ons basically by choosing remove and then installing the latest update. But just the process of disabling an add-on eliminates its preferences. And to show that in action, I was actually about to make a backup because I'm just so impulsive with it. But if we look at Kitops, right, we'll just turn off autosave preferences. If we just go in here and we toggle this thing off and on, which is basically what you're doing when you're removing and adding a new add-on, you're going to lose this information. Of course, you can export your settings and re-import them, but we didn't think of doing that. And so we didn't save our preferences. So let's just close Blender without saving. And we'll just open it up again. And we at least still have our paths because we didn't save our preferences with what we were just doing there. So we still have our paths. We're still good to go. But let's talk about updating. Well, now that we know about your location on the computer, you can now basically replace and delete these folders at will. Like, for example, I can go in and just delete HardOps, the folder, which is HardOps. And if I were to open up the zip file that's provided of the latest version, which in this case is hops 987 francium 4, we can just drag this folder over to this location, and now HardOps has been updated. And if we were to close and reopen Blender, we are now using the latest version. And now that we're back in business, we can go under our hops button and we see that it says that we are now up to date. So box cutter as well, if we press Alt W, you see that this version is also out of date. So if we were to just close Blender, we can just go in here and delete the box cutter folder. And I'm just going to open up the latest box cutter zip, which is 717_16. We did an A release in order to fix a few last minute issues. So we will now just close these zips out now that we've copied them over. And if we open up Blender, we see that the weight is just killing me. But we see that now we are updated to the latest version. And best of all, we didn't lose our preferences. So if I go in the end panel, we see that everything is set up for Kitops, which means that everything is set up for us to get in and begin synthing. But for the most part, that is installation and understanding your configuration in a nutshell and how it goes with updating add-ons. So I haven't yet talked about any of the Windows applications that I particularly enjoy when it comes to maintaining these paths and finding balance. So one of them is this program called Folder Git. So we will just go back to our add-ons folder. And the thing about Folder Git is once you have it installed, it allows you to right click and you can add a path to your paths file. And this may seem a little complex, but it's also quite complex being able to remember all this stuff. So if we open the path editor, we see that this new path has been added. However, we want to rename it. So let's just rename this to, in fact, I think we did that one wrong. Yes, so that path doesn't exist. We actually have to remove it. Sorry about that. Let's re-add it. So we will add this to the paths file, and then we can open up the paths editor. And we want to rename the second one. It gets tricky. So let's just make this window big. Edit item name, and we'll just call this scripts. And so now I have this location in my folder Git called scripts that whenever I click on it, it brings me to this location inside of 2.83. In fact, I may want to open up the path editor and modify this file so that it works a little bit better. So instead of going all the way there, we want to probably go to the Blender location, but we don't want to go into any particular version. So that way, whenever we say scripts, or in fact, we don't even want to call it scripts. Sorry, my mind's all over the place. We just want to call this installs. So now that it's called Blender installs, we just right click and folder Git. It takes us to the Blender installs location where we can go in, jump into our scripts and add-ons and just manage the add-ons for a specific installation. But the thing is that now that I've configured one Blender, I don't want to migrate to another version of Blender and deal with that. So now let's talk about that. So now there's a new Blender out, 2.93, and we haven't yet begun to jump to it because we've been spending all of our time configuring 2.83.12. But the thing is you want to use the latest version of Blender, but you don't want to move your configuration and have to reconfigure everything all over again and be dealing with exponentially more folders for each version of Blender. And while the method I'm about to discuss isn't the most recommended method, it is my method, which is what I aim to discuss in this video. So first things first, we've configured 2.83, but we did not configure 2.93. If we pop it open, there's no add-ons in it. There's nothing. It's blank, it's bare, it's naked. So let's just close that. We don't want it. Let's just delete the 2.83 folder. And the thing that I'm using for this is called link shell extension, which allows you to create symbolic links of folders. So what I'm going to do is right click 2.83, and we're just going to choose pick link source, and then we're just going to drop as a symbolic link. And so basically now there's a symbolic link of a folder that is pointing to the previous folder, and we're going to just change the name to be 2.93. So now when Blender opens, it's not going to even know that this is a fake folder. It's just going to open and pop up exactly like the other Blender did. And so now we're able to get to work. In fact, we haven't even made it where it starts up in Box Cutter and made that our default setup, because that is definitely my default setup, Box Cutter on blast. So let's just Control Q, quit this, and let's just launch it again. And now we see that, you know, once the splash screen's out the way, we are ready to rumble with Box Cutter. And that's really all there is to it when it comes to migrating your installation across Blenders. So there's another version of Blender. There's 2.92, which is probably going to be the next stable. So this one I've also been spending some time in. I like to spend my time in all the different versions of Blender, just ensuring that everything's completely stable. And we see that this one has no configuration. So I'm just going to close that because I have no time for such things. I'm going to right click the 2.83 folder, pick the link source, and we are just going to drop as a symbolic link. And so now that we have this, we can change this to 2.92, and we're able to continue on with our installation setup. So now everything that we do for one Blender happens for all of them across multiple versions. So we now have 2.92 coming up, ready to rumble inside of Box Cutter. And of course, if there's some change in the preferences or the way that they're remembered across versions, it's definitely going to cause an issue with this. So just keep that in mind. Like I said, this isn't the most recommended method, but it is definitely my method for managing all these versions of Blender. So I don't even deal with them on a individual level anymore. I deal with them just with one folder as the root, and then it just continues propagating. In fact, I can right click this, pick link source, paste a symbolic link, and we'll just name this one 2.94 because it's coming up in the future. And that's how Proxy likes to work. He has his links just named up all the way to the future that we may never see, but it's just set up. And now we have all these versions of Blender configured. We can go to the experimental builds where I've been checking out some of the sculpt dev stuff and also playing with geometry nodes before at time. But really when it comes to experimental, I was obsessed with new booleans. So even when I pop those open, we see that this one was built for Blender 2.91, which isn't actually in this list. So if we pop it open, it's going to show us a newborn baby. In fact, we didn't even get to see it, but here's our splash screen. If it shows a select with and a spacebar option along with theme, that's not going to work. So we want to also have one for 2.91. So I'm just right clicking, picking my link source, and we're dropping it as a symbolic link. Like I said, there are some restrictions that may apply if they change the formatting of preferences across Blender in the future. But for the most part, it's been pretty straightforward and we haven't run into issues with it yet. But this is just how we deal with newer versions of Blender internally. So now I can actually go to the new Boolean branch where, you know, Howard was working on the new Booleans, which have, you know, changed the way I approach some aspects of modeling. And we can now go under behavior, change our Boolean solver to exact, press F4, bring up our preferences. And I'm not saying you should work this way, but I'm saying it is allowed now as a result of recent updates. But we can now set this to 0 and cut, you know, completely fitting on the surface. But there are some things that are still up in the air with it that I feel need to be addressed. But for the most part, it does support using exact. However, the offsetting is something that is still a bit of a struggle, and eventually someday we aim to be able to perfectly extend shapes without you having to deal with any sort of offset issues. In fact, with this one, we see that it extended it off into the future without any offset issue. So it still is something that we're addressing, but just letting you know that when you have your Blender configured across multiple versions like this, that it also unlocks additional things within the add-ons for you to be able to do, because we're always looking towards the future when it comes to our tools, but we also want to make sure that we're working with the last official version. So the next thing I want to talk about is miscellaneous add-on installation. Right now I'm on Mirror Tools, which is one of my favorite Blender tools. For this one, you could just choose to download it by clicking on this link, and then you have it downloaded. So if we pop this open, we can look inside of here and we see that there's a folder. And your first thought would be, oh, a folder. Well, based off of everything that we've discussed today, that means that I would just go in my 2.83 folder, scripts, add-ons, and I would just place this folder in there. However, I gotta tell you that it's not actually equipped for that because of the format. You know, if we look at this root folder, we go into it, we see that there's not a init.py, which is normally what initializes an add-on. So we need to go in deeper and locate the format that he has set up. And this is something that's never going to load as an add-on. In fact, once you go into Mirror Tools, you find the init.py, which tells us that one folder back, this is the add-on. So this is the one that we want to install. As you see, Mifth tools is comprised of a multitude of tools, but we just want to deal with just this one. Hopefully you understand, you know, if you don't see an init.py, that means that this folder is not an add-on. It's a folder of possibly scripts, but a little context mastery can definitely help make these things more clear. So now that we have Mirror Tools here, that means that we can just pop open any old version of Blender because they're all linked now. And once we snap this into place, we can just go into our preferences, which I like to go to preferences with F4, but we're just going to find Mirror Tools. We're going to enable that. And while we're here, I recommend enabling Curve Tools. And while you're here, I recommend enabling Edit Mesh Tools. And I also recommend enabling F2. I mean, why is F2 not enabled off the bat, you know? You also probably want to enable Node Wrangler. In fact, we can just go scrolling down the list and just kind of looking at what add-ons we need to our general experience. However, just know that enabling everything is going to make your Blender really trippy and hardly useful, but you just want to just kind of scroll down, look for what you need, and after that just save your preferences. So now that we have Mirror Tools, that means I could stretch this cube out, put a couple of edge loops in it, and press Control Shift tilde. Is it Control Shift tilde? I forget. We'll just enable Curve Stretch through the menu, and now we can go in and begin deforming this using a curve. So mirror is important to me when it comes to maintaining a very particular form that's simplified through this NURB structure, but I just love this thing. Someday I hope to make our own so we can begin expanding on the concept, but this tool is just one of my favorites. So we'll just right click cancel, but that is how you would install Mirror Tools. So let's talk about another add-on. Another one that's a classic is Power Snapping Pies. I'll have this one linked in the description as well. But basically this one is like a GitHub repo that's like a Python file. And so the only way to save this is to, basically look at the raw, and we'll right click Save Page As, and we'll just save this to our 2.83 location. And instead of saving it as a text document, we want to save it as all files, which means it'll save its py extension. Otherwise we'll have .py.txt, which will never load as an add-on. So now we've installed this like script add-on, and I just want to pop it open real quick so we can talk about it. You don't have to be a scripter or a developer to understand an add-on. All you got to know is that an add-on starts off with a BL info boilerplate kind of introductory kind of stanza of information. And so if you have a script that doesn't have this information, more than likely it is not an add-on, it's a script. So I have an example of one of these such scripts that I'll pop up. All right, here we go. So once upon a time I was sent this script and was asked why was this not enabled as an add-on, and I just couldn't help but chuckle a little bit because I look at this and it's so obviously a script, and a script is something that you would just throw in a text editor. So something like this, like if I wanted to actually run this, because some people work like this, some people aren't trying to make add-ons, some people just want to make a little script to solve a problem. And with these you would need to go to like the scripting tab, and you would put the script here, and we would just this is saying basically if there's not 3 objects, return it. So that means you need to have 3 objects according to this first line. So if we just click on run, we see that it runs the script. And not saying that this is how you should operate, but if you see something that's just import BPY and then def and some stuff, it's basically talking about just doing a thing. It's not an add-on. Don't try to install it. It's crazy. But just wanted to point that out. So because it's visually obvious, if there's not boilerplate text in there, like what we were seeing with, snap pies, then you definitely don't want to try to install it as an add-on. So, once you know that, add-ons are pretty straightforward. You could just look at something and tell, okay, this is a folder. I need to put it in here where there's a init file 1 folder deep, and that will allow this to enable as an add-on. And so once you have that understanding, you have complete mastery over your installation and you are in control of it. Not saying you can take your setup and put it on another computer, might be weird, but that's just the first step. I mean, understanding and mastering your Blender setup is definitely something that we want users capable of, because it gives the control back to you, the user, and it keeps you from being fearful of jumping to another version in the future and updating and moving your preferences. I mean, even if you're not using folder git, you are able to easily go in and, let's see, I'm trying to go back to the add-ons. Here we go. So now we're back in our Blender installs. Even if you're not using folder git, I could just press Control C, Control V, and just paste another copy. And this is actually a duplicate of this installation as well. And we could name this, 2.95, or actually we'll name it 2.80. Just in case 2.80 requires something. But just like that, I'm able to duplicate my setup. I'm also able to duplicate my configuration by just copying the config folder and pasting it in any of these other ones. As long as you see this, that means they're shortcuts onto themselves. It's not going to imply it in the top bar, but you see when I click, or let's see, when I click on the name, it does reveal the true version because that's where I actually am, versus this 2.93 is actually a fake location. So just letting you know that that's really all your installation is. And once you have that as an understanding, it's a lot easier to control. So once we go back, we can just pop open Blender. And I'm not sure if we actually enabled snapping pies, but that would be a good place to end this chapter. I will press F4, go to preferences. And before we enable this, I'm going to press Shift S and look at what the options you get for snapping are. There's no option to basically set the origin to anything in this option. So anytime I see this version of Shift S, I'm like, ooh, oh no, it just scares me. So we'll just go in and enable snapping pies, right click to never see that again. And now you see that we have options for origin to cursor, origin to geometry, which are just some of my favorite options in Blender, and having them connected to Shift S is just essential to me. One of my favorite things is to just select the bottom face, Shift S, origin to selected, and now the origin is here. And I can just press Alt G and it's just on the top, sitting on the floor. So really just snapping pie is just one of those things I just love. I was sad to see it not make it over to 2.8, and since it was such a small script, just felt that we could probably do the port job to help out. But with that, hopefully you guys have a better understanding of add-ons, and let's continue.